welcome you back to our conversation. For those of you joining us maybe for the first time, we are doing our worship service in a little different order. We are really focusing in these days on being a disciple and making disciples. And so we thought to better facilitate our learning and conversation, we would just meet in the round, so to speak. And so we're doing that. We'll be considering different parts of Scripture each Sunday. And we invite you to, I'll try to tell you what passage we're studying. Maybe we'll have it on the screen. But we invite you to follow along. It's an important part of our walk with the Lord, is to know His Word and understand how to apply it in our lives. So again, we welcome you this morning, and I welcome all of you. Glad that you're here. If you want to go ahead and get prepared this morning, we're looking at in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 25 is where we'll be. While you're looking that up, we'll at the very beginning, Matthew 25, 1 through 13. This morning's passage we're going to look at it's a story. It's a parable. And there's some things that are maybe important in just understanding how to read the Scripture. And I don't mean to suggest that I know all about it, but some of the things that I've learned is, it's when you tell a story, there's a context in which you tell that story, out of which the story emerges. And it's helpful to know, because if the context you're speaking of is different from the context the audience is familiar with, well, you can easily get lost and miss the meaning of the story. Get caught up in trying to understand and relate when it just doesn't make any sense. And so the context for this morning's story is the first century, and prior to that, with the people of God, the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews, and the way in which some weddings took place, and the way in which some marriages came about. It's very different than we in our Western culture, we in the U.S., in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Most of us don't go about it in the same way. So I tell you that to say that there'll be things in this story that you think, why are they doing that? We may touch on it, we may not, but I want you to understand that's why. There are things like that. And so if there's something odd, don't waste a lot of time, don't get hung up on it. We'll talk about it either now or afterwards. One of the other things that's important to know is that when you're telling a story, and I'm sure this is the way it is for you, when you're telling somebody a story, particularly if it's maybe a hypothetical story, you've kind of crafted a story to tell to make a point. Well, what's the idea of the story? The point you're trying to make. It's not necessarily to answer all the questions of the audience. And so when you read somebody else's story, sometimes you have questions that they just didn't think of or didn't intend to discuss. That too will probably be the case here. So I just want you to know those things as we get into it. Now, I'd love to invite us to read along, and I wonder if one of you would be willing to read. It's a fairly easy story, Matthew 25, 1 through 13.
At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps, went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the doors for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour."
Now again, context is everything. And if you're studying this on your own, if you plan to study it this afternoon or sometime this week, I would encourage you to read this parable, this first part of chapter 25, in the context of Matthew's chapters 24 and 25. it falls kind of within that, and there are three parables, three stories, if you will. This is the middle one, but they're all working toward the same point. Now, that being the case, when you heard this story, or perhaps you know it just from your past study, were there any particular questions that came to mind? Were there anything in this story that struck you?
What was the purpose of supposedly the 10 virgins? Why?
Yeah.
I mean, was it to choose one or?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great question, and depending on the translation you read, some translate it as virgins, some translate it as bridesmaids, which gives you a little bit more of a clue. Some translate it just simply as young women. The idea, the cultural idea that was prevalent at that time in that area was that weddings had several stages. You know, weddings were kind of prearranged in many instances, and so the groom would go maybe to the parents' house, and because that's who was making it, the bride, but all the arrangements, the financial arrangements especially, were being made. Something kind of odd to us today, but those arrangements were being made, and then afterwards, after the arrangements were made, the wedding, the marriage was actually legal and binding from that point on. But the ceremony was still to occur. And so this story kind of picks up following those arrangements being made. And the bride is waiting, the groom is to arrive, and the bridesmaids, or these young women, these virgins, given to us to indicate they were young women, probably preteen or very early teen age. These women were going to escort. They were going to light the way. They would light the way to the ceremony. They would enter into the banquet room or wherever. It would be closed up so they could celebrate and enjoy. That was the way it was to be. So this is part of the context we're reading in. Good question. Are there others? Anything else that seemed interesting or unusual? Something that struck you about this story? While you're looking, I'll point out a couple of additional things that might be of interest to us today. You know, it gets down to this place where it says, well, it's talking about foolish ones and wise ones, and one of the distinctions it makes right off the bat is that, well, a lack of distinction, wise and foolish ones, they all fall asleep. So apparently the falling asleep is not the issue. Why would that be the case? I mean, if I'm thinking about a wedding today and the bridesmaids, if I can just use it, that all fell asleep when the wedding party arrived, there might be an issue. But in this day, again, keep in mind, the groom had to attend a financial arrangements meeting first. He could have gotten tied up. There are a number of things that may have waylaid him. It may not be a real fault on anybody's part. It just happened. And so these young women were charged with the responsibility to take their lamps to light the way, and in that day they used oil to do it. Whether it was lamps or torches, we're not sure. Either way, you had to have oil to light it. Now, one of the distinctions made in this wise and foolishness is that some had enough oil and some didn't. I wonder if it struck you, and again, we read it only one time, and if you're not familiar with it, you probably didn't have time for this to dawn on you, but in our day and age, you might have said, well, so they will all wake up, 5 of them realize they don't have enough oil. The other 5 aren't willing to share with them. What's up with that? I mean, that's not very kind. It's helpful to think through, what is Jesus saying as he's telling this story about the wise and the foolish? They had a responsibility I just described to you. It was their job to light the way for the groom to get to where he was going. If you didn't have enough oil and the light ran out, he'd be wandering around in the dark. So if I'm one of the ones that has enough oil and you've asked me to share with you, well, if I'm really wise, I'm going to calculate. If there are 5 of us with enough oil, the way will be lit. But if we share the oil, we may have brighter light for part of the way, but then we may run out. there may be no light at all. That opened my eyes when I was reading through this, because frankly, that tripped me up the first time I read it.
Yeah, I think there's multiple things at play. I mean, I'd give the virgins a pass for falling asleep,
Right.
because it's stated very clearly. It's midnight now.
Right.
So we don't know how long were the financial negotiations. How long was it? Was it hours? Because most weddings don't take place late at night. They take place more early in the afternoon, or early in the morning, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, whatever. So
Sure.
you kind of give them a pass for at least I do, for falling asleep. But the definition of foolish and wise is stated clearly, that the wise ones took bottles of oil with them.
That's right.
So in my mind, I'm kind of going, okay, they were prepared, but they had thought through, is this going to be quick, or is this going to go late at night?
That's right.
Type of thing. So if they were young, they might have been coached by someone responsible for them, like a parent.
Sure.
To say, hey, you're going to be this type of thing. And I think also what is being looked at here, it mentions virgins. Why, at some point, you got to go, okay, why is that mentioned instead of 10 young women?
Sure.
The virgin aspect would connotate purity,
That's right.
unsoiled, etc.
Sure.
As well. So you had that piece going along in there as well, I think.
Yeah. So it's interesting to proceed through this and realize, once the 5 answer, we're not basically sharing any of our oil. The instruction then is the other 5, got to go find some. And so they take off and go. And what happens while they're gone? The groom shows up. And they miss it completely. Now again, what happens if that's us? We're out getting oil. We come back and the party's gone. Well, we take off and get to the destination as quickly as we can, and we say, hey, we're here, albeit late, let us in. There's no letting in. What's up with that? Again, for our culture, it's an odd thing. It strikes you. And in that culture, hearing it was intended to be odd. That was not a cultural thing that Jesus was tapping into, as much as he was saying, you don't want to be late. You don't want to be kept from being able to get inside and participate. Your lack of planning, your lack of wisdom in thinking ahead, as Jim said, has left you in a precarious position. Now, we may be giving you some ideas of where we're headed this morning in our conversation. How does this apply to discipleship for us? Why is Jesus telling this story? I mentioned earlier it's in the context of 24 and 25, and just briefly, the Pharisees and teachers of the law have really been after Jesus. That's not new news. Most of us know that. They've been questioning him. And in the midst of all their questioning, he's delivering to them woes for not being good leaders, for not adequately preparing God's people to follow God. His disciples come along and they ask privately to Jesus, what does all this mean? All these woes that you're telling them, all the bad things that are going to happen, when's all this going to happen? When's it going to take place? They're looking for a sign. They're looking for some way of knowing when it's going to happen. And this is one of the stories that Jesus tells. As we just talked about, these brides are the bridesmaids, these 5 that are unwise. They haven't done the preparation. They haven't thought through what's needed. And so they're left out. It's a word to us as disciples today, even though the context is very different. Are we prepared? Are we prepared to enter into whatever the Lord has called us to do. Sometimes the phrase is made, at least on so-and-so's deathbed, they accepted Jesus. And while I don't want to deny the possibility of God's grace in any situation, and I don't in any way mean to say today that that person did not get into heaven. I'm not the one that has the ability to judge that, even if I had the wisdom. But this story tells us something different about Jesus' intention. It tells us something about not just getting saved, but about living the life with the Lord, about living the life of discipleship, of growing more and more in His likeness. And He tells these stories to try to help us get the picture that there is preparation needed. Well, discipleship, being a disciple, being a student, being a follower of Jesus requires ongoing learning and growth and study and obedience. Again, that may be known by us, and we might be able to answer that in a Q&A type setting. But when you put it into story form, and you then begin to think about how a story develops, and you then put that story into our lives, it's very interesting to consider in light of where our culture has gone. What are the values of our culture today? One of those values is instantaneous response. Another value is having options. Always. We work very hard at having lots and lots and lots of options. And sometimes we rebel against someone telling us, this is the way to go, and you must prepare to do it. Right? It's a difficult thing to hear someone tell you, this is not necessarily about options. This is about understanding what's being asked and preparing for it.
In my opinion, one of the overarching values of our culture is self. It's all about me.
That's right.
Yeah, I want mine.
That's right. Yeah.
Why do I need anything else, or why do I need to look outside? You know, I got what I need. I'm going, and if I don't have what I need, I'll go get it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And this story would suggest you may not have time to go get it.
Right.
Now that requires some beliefs. That requires belief that we don't determine our own destiny, someone else does. We have a part in it. We can accept that there is a God and He's not me.
Yeah.
We can accept that He has called me to live in a particular way, and it's not totally up to me to determine how that is. But these kind of assumptions are behind being a disciple of Jesus. And to understand them, to accept them, comes with certain other requirements. And one of those is to continually be preparing. Because we don't know when He's going to come. This is part of what the disciples were asking. They were clearly understanding it's not going to go well for those who have aligned themselves differently.
I think that one of the most important passages in this parable is verse 12.
Yeah.
It's, truly, I don't know you.
Right. Yeah. And you think to yourself, in this story, well, how would he not know them? And again, that's a cultural thing. We focus on knowing, but is he saying you weren't in line with what you were supposed to be doing? Your role was to participate in this way. We're not about the same agenda. It's a challenge for us as followers. It's a challenge for us because, just as you said, in our culture today, in many instances, the emphasis is on what I want and that I should be able to decide not just what I want, but when I want it, how I get it, what I do with it. Following Jesus is not quite like that. There are some definites that he gives us, and we have to understand those and be prepared to follow them. I'm wondering what's going through your mind as I'm telling you this. How do we convey to others with a story like this the joy of following Jesus? How do we convey to those maybe who don't know but are searching, having rules, having a certain way, having the discipline to follow, being prepared according to what's expected is good? How do we convey that? Well, I can tell you from personal experience, it doesn't do a lot of good to just talk to them. Because even those of us who have chosen to follow, who have already made that decision and are working to understand, sometimes it kind of sticks because it doesn't line up with what I want to do or what I think I ought to be able to do. Imagine what it's like for someone who's not used to living under any kind of discipline at all, or having the freedom to make all the choices at any time they want. So if the speaking of it isn't the way that's going to happen, maybe the living is, right? If I can represent in my living, in my lifestyle, in my way of relating to people, those who know Jesus and following, those who don't, a joy in my life, a foundation, a sense of security, a sense of confidence that life is going to work out well. Maybe not in the values of the culture, of the unbelieving culture, but I have hope that is guaranteed by the Lord for good and prosperous life eventually. Some receive it in this life, some the next. But even in this life, to live without the three biggies that I think are plaguing us today: anxiety, disruptions, and distractions. If I can live my life with less degree of anxiety, if I can weather the storms, so to speak, the disruptions that occur, and we're being disrupted all the time now. And if I can somehow find a way to overcome the constant distractions that we're all plagued with. Good grief. When's the last time you actually were in a situation where you felt, not just in a moment, but in an ongoing sense, a sense of relaxation, an absence of anxiety, a confidence, regardless of all the disruptions happening around you? I know a greater story. I'm a part of something bigger. This doesn't define who I am, and it doesn't shake me. And because of that confidence, because of a relationship we can have with the Lord, He enables us to focus and not be so distracted. And in the times when we can't handle it, any of these, we can take it back to Him and say, Lord, I need help with this. I am struggling. Help me.
Terry and I were, I don't know if the term fortunate applies or not, but we got to hear Oliver North share some of his faith. And as he went through the Contra hearings, they ended up having to build a fence around their home, the North family.
Like the barbed wire on the top, the whole, like a prison fence.
Wow.
To keep reporters and et cetera out.
Yeah.
And every day that he went in for the Senate hearings, on that, he would be chauffeured, and the press would be like vultures waiting outside the gate and shoving microphones, etc. And one of the reporters noticed that he had a newspaper and a Bible on the back seat with him. And they said something about it, and he said, well, I don't know, I'm not going to quote him exactly 100%, but he said, those are the two things I read in the morning. I first read the truth, and he held up the Bible, and then I read what you guys say.
Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And
You
I
got
think
applause
that's,
for that.
I'm sure he did.
That's the piece
That's
that you're
right.
talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Again, when I read this story the first time, maybe for you, maybe not, but when I read this story, it really struck me. It struck me even as a Christian, because the emphasis that we're supposed to share and serve others and care for them and look out for others, that the 5 with the oil would not have shared with the others. I really didn't know what to do with that. And it challenged me when I began to read from those who have spent their lives studying, and it opened my eyes to the wisdom to know, yes, I'm called to serve, yes, I'm called to help, but I'm called first and foremost to follow my Lord. I am called first and foremost to carry out the responsibilities that He's given me. And one of those is serving. But in this instance, their specific responsibility was to light the way. And if they had given to the others and then not had enough oil to light the way at all, the whole thing would have fallen apart. And it challenged me. It challenged me to think, am I that focused? Am I that aligned? Do I understand what I'm being asked to do and the order of priorities? Because if I do, and the better I understand that, I don't mean to say that all of a sudden I can just wake up and boom, I'm brilliant. But the more I learn about the way of the Lord, the more I understand the priorities that He has for me, the way in which He would instruct me through His Word and His Spirit of how to live this life with all of the anxiety and the disruptions and the distractions, then I can be at peace. I can be at peace knowing I'm following and I'm asking for His help. It helps relieve a part of that.
I think too, in this culture that we live in, there are so many distractions that it's easy for us to fall asleep
It is.
and not keep watch and not remember that we don't know when He's coming back.
That's right.
And so we get complacent or fall asleep. And so I think it's a warning to
It
us in
is.
that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a sense in the keep alert, keep awake, or keep watch, or it's really saying be alert. Be alert and aware.
Don't give up the anticipation.
Don't give up the anticipation. Yeah. It's you can imagine in that day and time when Jesus had arisen and the disciples were still wrestling with all of what they had seen and heard and grappling with what's going on, and now Jesus is going away, but He's told us He's coming back. The natural expectation would be He's coming soon. And He doesn't come, and He doesn't come, and He doesn't come, and He doesn't come. Okay, translate that into our culture. What happens? What happens when you and I expect something to happen soon, and then it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen?
You start questioning.
We start questioning.
You get frustrated, you get angry,
That's right.
and then you get smart.
What else happens? Or what were you going to say? Sorry.
You give up.
You give up.
And there are those of us who are sitting in this room who have followed a particular football team, and we have hopes that they'll get to a national title, and they don't. So we give up. And then there are those sitting in this room who follow a football team who've won back-to-back national titles, so they're like, oh, God.
You're right.
Our expectation of each
That's exactly right.
is different. So that's you know, have we fallen asleep?
Sure.
You know,
It's natural. It is natural for us, after waiting and waiting and waiting and not receiving or not experiencing or not reaching, to start to give up. It's just natural. And Jesus is trying to say, resist that. Don't fall to that temptation. Stay alert.
I think there's another branch that we can go down, keeping in the mode of discipleship,
Okay.
is also don't fall asleep in following the marching orders that I gave you.
Yeah,
Yeah. You don't know when I'm coming back,
absolutely.
so don't continue to be diligent in sharing as best you can
That's right.
me with others.
Sure.
And discipling them to become better followers of me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Followers of Jesus.
There's a great writing that Shakespeare did. It's one of his lesser known books, but it's on the Greeks' invasion of Troy.
Yep.
And the generals describe exactly this. And when they're questioning why is it taking us so long to take the city, and the general's answer is exactly pertaining to this.
That's right. That's exactly right. Patience. Keep waiting. Keep being prepared.
And you said degree of anxiety. That's cool, because the word that they used for natural order was degree.
Yeah.
So to them, that was degree,
Yeah.
and their lack of degree.
That's right. There's so much of the preparation required of getting the mindset, even in such a simple story. I need to be prepared. I need to have enough oil. We don't know why the 5 didn't bring enough oil. Maybe they just were caught off guard and they were in a hurry and they just grabbed their torches and ran.
They were foolish.
Yeah.
Well, they weren't anticipating, of course, they didn't have the lamps burning while they were waiting, did they?
Actually, I think they did.
They ran out, and didn't anticipate a 5-hour wait.
In the translation that Jim read, the NIV, I'm assuming it read right along with mine, and I've got the NIV. It says that when they awoke, they had to get up and trim their lamps.
Yeah.
If that's not familiar to you, what that basically means is they had to get it ready to be in a condition to burn. Trim off the dead, get it set at the right level, this sort of thing. Again, it's preparations. And at that time they realized, uh-oh, we're in trouble. We don't have any more oil. A lamp's not going to burn, a torch is not going to burn without fuel. It's a very simple story with great implications for us. And again, if I'm trying to teach somebody else in this culture today, in this, I want to keep all options open, I don't need to prepare for anything long term, I don't need to stick with something, because I can always choose later, or I can always come back later.
It'll wait.
It'll wait. I don't want to commit. I may want to change my mind. Jesus' story speaks a little differently. In our culture today of some of the other values that we talked about, this story challenges us. And it's part of why I can continue to encourage us to go back to the Word and study it. And study it in group settings where we can talk about it and share, because the Lord gives us different insights and different questions to help challenge and encourage. It's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating story to consider the implications. It's an invitation with serious consequences for how we choose to respond. So I want to encourage you today to spend time. Spend time in these 2 chapters. Spend time recognizing that Jesus was forecasting what was to come. And while he was forecasting, as we appropriately often talk about, being prepared for his second coming, he was also talking about for them at that time, because it wasn't going to be too many years down the road that everything they knew, their whole way of life would be destroyed when the Romans came in and took down the temple and destroyed their hierarchy. And it totally rearranged all that they were used to and enjoyed living under, or didn't enjoy. But change is disruptive. We live in a day and age where I doubt very seriously we're going to have any less distractions, less disruptions anytime soon. We live in an age when I doubt very seriously there's going to be a lowering of anxiety just because we choose to no longer be anxious. It's not rooted in ourselves. We're going to have to find somewhere else. Despite those voices that tell us you can find whatever you need inside yourself. Don't buy it. These are the opportunities we have for following one who has guidance, who has answers, who has lived out what he's teaching us, and has risen again to make it available for all.